Good evening. I want to begin tonight with a statement that may sound shocking to some and inevitable to others. Putin's empire is collapsing before our very eyes. What once stood as a symbol of defiance against Western hegemony, what once projected power from the Arctic to the Black Sea, is now showing cracks that no amount of propaganda or military posturing can conceal. The same alliances that once propped up Moscow's vision of a multipolar world are beginning to crumble, not with the noise of bombs, but with the silence of betrayal. To understand this unraveling, we must first understand the illusion that sustained it. For 2 decades, Vladimir Putin built his empire not just through military strength, but through a complex web of economic dependencies, political alignments, and energy deals. Russia sold gas, oil, and weapons. In return, it bought loyalty, or at least silence. But empires built on transactional alliances are fragile by design. When profits decline, when wars drag on, and when sanctions bite deep, those same allies start to recalculate their loyalties. What we're witnessing today is the classic collapse of imperial overreach. The war in Ukraine was not just a military miscalculation, it was an economic suicide note. Russia's economy, already dependent on exports, found itself isolated. The ruble fell, inflation soared, and industries, once proud of their independence, now depend on China, India, and a handful of sympathetic nations. Yet even those allies, Beijing, Delhi, Ankara, are hedging their bets. China, the supposed strategic partner, is quietly exploiting Russia's weakness, buying energy at discounted prices, and expanding influence in Central Asia, a region Russia once called its backyard. India, while maintaining diplomatic politeness, has diversified its energy imports, signaling that Moscow's dominance in South Asia is fading. And within the post-Soviet space, nations like Kazakhstan, Armenia, and even Belarus are rethinking their futures, wondering whether aligning with a declining power is worth the risk. This is not just a political realignment, it's an economic one. As a Marxian economist, I must remind you, economic power precedes political collapse. When a nation's industries hollow out, when its population loses trust in leadership, and when elites begin moving their wealth abroad, the empire's fall becomes not a question of if, but when. And that's precisely what's happening inside Russia today. But let us also be clear. The collapse of one empire does not automatically mean justice for the oppressed or stability for the world. Every time an empire crumbles, chaos tries to fill the vacuum. The Western powers, quick to celebrate Russia's decline, are themselves navigating crises of inequality, inflation, and global distrust. The danger lies not in Putin's fall, but in what comes after, who controls Russia's vast resources, its nuclear arsenal, and its fractured political identity. Still, history has a sense of irony. The very tactics Putin used to destabilize others, energy blackmail, information warfare, military adventurism, are now being used against him. His own allies are outmaneuvering him economically and strategically. The collapse is not coming from NATO's bombs, but from within the very architecture he built to resist them. So what lesson do we draw from this? Empires, no matter how powerful, are not eternal. They fall when arrogance blinds them to economic reality, when fear replaces dialogue, and when loyalty is bought instead of earned. Putin's empire is no exception. It rose on the promise of restoring Russian greatness. It may fall under the weight of its own contradictions. And as the world watches this slow disintegration, we should not just ask how Russia fell, but why the system that sustains such empires keeps repeating itself. Because until we change the global logic of exploitation, dominance, and endless competition, the next empire, whoever builds it, will follow the same doomed path. Thank you. The crumbling of Vladimir Putin's power structure is not a sudden event, but the result of years of overreach, miscalculation, and an unsustainable political model built on control rather than cooperation. What the world is witnessing today is not just a political decline, it's a structural decay from within an empire that once projected confidence, dominance, and defiance against the West. The illusion of stability that Putin carefully constructed over 2 decades is unraveling, exposing the fragility of a regime built more on fear than faith. The signs are everywhere, from the silent dissent within his own circle to the growing discontent among ordinary Russians, and to the visible erosion of trust among the very allies who once praised his assertive leadership. The first crack in this once solid facade came with Russia's war in Ukraine, which was intended to reassert dominance and remind the world of Moscow's power. Instead, it has backfired spectacularly. The military setbacks, staggering human and economic costs, and the international condemnation that followed have not only weakened Russia's global standing, but also fractured its internal power dynamics. The Kremlin's propaganda machine can no longer mask the reality. Casualties are mounting, sanctions are suffocating the economy, and the supposed unity of purpose within Russia's elite is disintegrating. Behind closed doors, fear has replaced loyalty, and whispers of blame have replaced vows of allegiance. The empire is beginning to eat itself from within, but the more striking collapse is not on the battlefield, it's in the corridors of power. For years, Putin ruled with a mix of charisma, coercion, and calculated manipulation of Russia's oligarchs, military leaders, and political elites. His strength lay in his ability to balance their competing interests while positioning himself as the indispensable center of authority. Yet today, that balance has been lost. The once cohesive ruling elite is splintering as the costs of his decisions mount. Many of the oligarchs who once benefited from proximity to power have fled, lost fortunes, or fallen silent in fear of retribution. The generals who once boasted of quick victories now face the humiliation of defeat and dwindling morale. The bureaucrats who enforced his will now question whether the system can even sustain itself. Economically, the collapse of the Russian power structure is most visible in its dependence on shrinking energy markets and crumbling foreign investment. The country that once wielded oil and gas as political weapons is now forced to sell them at cut-rate prices to countries exploiting its desperation. The sanctions have not merely hurt the economy, they have dismantled the myth of Russia's resilience. Factories have closed, the ruble has lost credibility, and inflation has eroded public confidence. The empire that promised prosperity through strength now struggles to feed its illusion of greatness. And perhaps the most dangerous part for Putin is that people are beginning to see through the illusion. Inside Russia, the tightening grip of repression speaks volumes. When a regime feels secure, it opens dialogue. When it fears collapse, it silences. Journalists vanish, activists are jailed, and even loyal officials tread carefully with their words. This atmosphere of paranoia reflects the decaying core of Putin's system, one where control must now be maintained through intimidation rather than inspiration. Every empire falls when fear replaces belief, and that shift is already underway in Moscow. Internationally, Putin's image as a strategic mastermind has eroded. His former allies no longer see strength but desperation. His threats sound hollow, his alliances transactional. The empire's diplomatic reach has weakened, and nations that once sought Russia's partnership now approach with caution. The very foundation of his power, perception, has begun to collapse. Because in politics, as in economics, power is sustained not by force alone, but by belief in inevitability. Once that belief is broken, even the mightiest ruler stands exposed. And that is the essence of what we are witnessing, an empire imploding not from foreign invasion, but from internal exhaustion. Putin's power structure, built on propaganda, fear, and fragile alliances, is cracking under the weight of its contradictions. The collapse may not come overnight, but it has already begun, slowly, silently, and unmistakably. The world is not just watching the fall of a leader, it is witnessing the unmaking of a myth. The betrayal of allies has become one of the most striking symbols of Russia's growing isolation, a quiet but powerful sign that the empire Vladimir Putin built through years of calculated diplomacy is beginning to disintegrate. What once appeared as a network of loyal partners now reveals itself as a fragile web of convenience, one that unravels the moment the balance of power shifts. The same nations that stood beside Russia in defiance of the West are now stepping back, not with open hostility, but with the cold pragmatism of survival. In politics, loyalty lasts only as long as it is profitable, and for many of Russia's partners, that profit has vanished. China, once hailed by Moscow as an unwavering strategic ally, is now the most cautious partner of all. Beijing has mastered the art of silent betrayal. While it continues to buy Russian energy, it does so at heavily discounted rates, exploiting Russia's desperation while expanding its own influence across Central Asia, the very region Moscow once dominated. The message is subtle but unmistakable. China will engage with Russia as a supplier, not as an equal. Every barrel of cheap oil and cubic meter of gas that flows eastward strengthens Beijing's leverage and deepens Russia's dependence. Putin may present the relationship as a partnership, but in truth, it's becoming an arrangement of convenience, one in which Russia is the junior participant, not the co-architect. India, too, is playing a delicate balancing act. Though it continues to maintain ties with Moscow, Delhi's diplomacy speaks volumes about shifting loyalties. India's growing alignment with the United States, its participation in the Quad Alliance, and its diversification of defense and energy suppliers all point toward a future less tied to Russian influence. For decades, Russia was India's primary arms supplier and a trusted partner during times of global polarization. Today, however, that reliance is fading as India seeks technological and economic partnerships with Western nations. It's not betrayal in the emotional sense, it's geopolitical realism. India is securing its future in a world where Russia can no longer guarantee stability or strength. Even Turkey, a country that once played mediator and ally, is recalibrating. Ankara has learned to use Russia's vulnerabilities to its advantage, cooperating where it benefits, confronting when it suits. Turkey's control over the Black Sea region and its strategic role in NATO make it one of the few players capable of bending Russia's influence without direct confrontation. What Putin once viewed as leverage is now slipping through his fingers. The partnerships he cultivated through charm and coercion are turning transactional, guided not by loyalty but by opportunity. The most painful fractures, however, are emerging within the post-Soviet states, the nations that once formed the backbone of Moscow's regional dominance. Kazakhstan, once considered firmly within Russia's orbit, now resists Kremlin influence, seeking stronger economic ties with China and the West. Armenia, disillusioned by Russia's failure to provide military support during its conflicts, has begun to look elsewhere for security guarantees. Even Belarus, perhaps Putin's closest ally, shows signs of quiet unease as its own dependence on Russia becomes an economic and political burden. These nations are reading the winds of change. They understand that association with a declining power carries risks, and they are preparing for a future beyond Moscow's shadow. Behind this diplomatic erosion lies a deeper truth. Russia's alliances were built not on shared values, but on shared resentments. The partnerships that once seemed united against Western dominance were, in reality, bound together by convenience, not conviction. As Russia's power wanes, the glue that held this alliance together, mutual benefit, begins to dissolve. Each ally now calculates its own survival, its own economic and political trajectory, leaving Moscow increasingly isolated. This quiet betrayal cuts deeper than any sanction or military defeat because it strikes at the very heart of Putin's global narrative. His vision of a multipolar world depended on loyal partners willing to challenge Western influence alongside Russia. Now, those same partners are turning away, not out of fear of the West, but because they no longer see strength in Moscow. The optics have shifted from a confident empire leading an alternative world order to a struggling nation clinging to relevance. And perhaps the cruelest irony is that Putin's own strategy created the conditions for this betrayal. By relying on coercion instead of cooperation, by projecting dominance instead of partnership, he alienated those who might have stood by him in crisis. Today, as the empire trembles, Russia finds itself surrounded not by allies, but by opportunists. Every handshake hides hesitation, every agreement masks self-interest, and every promise echoes with uncertainty. The collapse of alliances, slow and subtle, may not make headlines like a battlefield defeat, but in the long run, it is far more fatal. Because when an empire loses the trust of its friends, it stands truly alone. The deepening economic isolation of Russia marks one of the most consequential and irreversible shifts in its modern history, a slow but devastating collapse that is reshaping both its domestic stability and its international influence. Once the world's energy powerhouse and a key player in global trade, Russia now finds itself cornered, constrained, and cut off from the financial systems that once enabled its ambitions. The story of this isolation is not merely about sanctions or lost markets. It is about the unraveling of an economy that mistook resource wealth for resilience and mistook state control for strength. The empire that once funded its global power through oil and gas revenues is now learning a painful truth. In the 21st century, economic isolation is the most powerful weapon of war. When the first wave of sanctions hit after the invasion of Ukraine, Moscow projected defiance. The Kremlin spoke confidently of self-reliance, of pivoting eastward, of creating new trade corridors that would bypass the West. But behind that bravado, the cracks began to form quickly. International investors fled. Major corporations withdrew from Russian markets. The banking sector, once integrated with Europe's financial system, became a closed circuit trapped within its own limitations. The result has been an economy that appears functional on the surface, but is quietly suffocating from within. The ruble's collapse, soaring inflation, and the exodus of skilled professionals have turned Russia's supposed resilience into a slow-motion implosion. What makes this isolation so corrosive is its cumulative effect. Each new sanction, each corporate exit, each cut in foreign technology transfers chips away at the machinery that once powered the Russian economy. The oil pipelines still run, but the profits have dwindled. The factories still produce, but with outdated components. The shelves in Moscow's stores are stocked, but with goods of lower quality and limited availability. The economy survives not through strength, but through improvisation. The empire has not adapted, it has merely learned to endure its own decline. This isolation has also changed the psychology of Russia's elite for decades. The country's oligarchs served as both enablers and beneficiaries of Putin's system. They enjoyed access to global markets, European real estate, and Western financial systems, all rewards for their loyalty. Now, cut off from those privileges, many of them see their fortunes evaporating and their futures narrowing, assets frozen abroad, travel restricted, reputations ruined. The isolation is personal as much as it is national. What was once a system built on wealth and influence is now a fortress of fear and frustration. The elite class that once anchored Putin's power base is beginning to fracture, its loyalty fading as its losses mount. But the real victims of Russia's economic isolation are its people. As inflation erodes savings and the cost of living soars, everyday Russians are forced to confront a reality that propaganda cannot disguise. Shortages of imported medicines, a declining quality of life, and rising unemployment are turning patriotic slogans into bitter reminders of unfulfilled promises. The regime's narrative of self-sufficiency rings hollow in a country where the average citizen feels poorer, more constrained, and less hopeful than before. The Kremlin can control information, but it cannot control hunger, prices, or disillusionment. And that quiet despair is perhaps the most dangerous force of all. It grows slowly, invisibly, until it can no longer be contained. On the global stage, Russia's isolation has reduced it from a major economic player to a dependent supplier of raw materials. Its trade partners, chiefly China and India, drive hard bargains, purchasing energy at heavy discounts and offering little in return beyond short-term lifelines. The loss of Western technology and markets has crippled entire industries, from aviation to automotive, leaving Russia increasingly reliant on imports from nations that see it as a weakened partner rather than a global equal. The empire that once wielded energy as a tool of influence is now trapped by its own dependence on energy exports. Yet, the most profound consequence of this economic isolation lies in what it reveals about power in the modern world. Military might can seize land, propaganda can shape narratives, but neither can substitute for a functioning economy. The West understood this long before the first sanctions were signed. Cut a nation off from capital, technology, and markets, and you slowly dismantle its capacity to sustain conflict. That is precisely what is happening to Russia. Its factories may continue to operate, its soldiers may still march, but the economic foundation beneath them is eroding quietly but relentlessly. The isolation is not a single blow, it is a tightening noose. Every passing month brings deeper losses, more dependency, and fewer options. The Kremlin can boast of surviving sanctions, but survival is not success. What we are witnessing is the slow strangulation of an empire that once mistook control for security and aggression for power. And as Russia's economy continues to shrink behind the walls it built for itself, the world sees not the defiance of a superpower, but the desperation of a nation running out of breath. The quiet rebellion of Russia's former satellite states is one of the most telling indicators of Moscow's weakening grip on its sphere of influence. What was once called the near abroad, a region bound by history, culture, and coercion, is now slowly slipping beyond Russia's control. The post-Soviet nations that long played the role of loyal neighbors are beginning to chart new paths, no longer seeing alignment with the Kremlin as a guarantee of stability, but as a potential liability. The echoes of empire are fading, replaced by an unmistakable shift in allegiance as one by one Russia's closest partners turn away. It is not an overnight revolt, but a gradual, deliberate distancing that speaks volumes about how the perception of Russian power has changed. For decades, Moscow ruled this region through a mix of fear, dependency, and nostalgia. The Kremlin used economic incentives, military pressure, and cultural ties to ensure compliance. Countries like Belarus, Armenia, and Kazakhstan were considered loyal by default, their economies tied to Russian pipelines, and their politics aligned with Moscow's interests. But now, those bonds are fraying. The war in Ukraine shattered the illusion of Russian invincibility and exposed the risks of being too close to an unpredictable neighbor. What once seemed like a protective alliance now feels like a trap, and these nations are quietly plotting their exits. Kazakhstan has emerged as the most symbolic example of this shift. Once considered one of Moscow's most reliable allies, it now resists Russian influence more openly than ever before. Astana refuses to recognize the annexation of Ukrainian territories. It welcomes Western investments, and it strengthens ties with China as a counterweight to Russian dominance. Even more telling is its growing cooperation with Western powers, a move that would have been unthinkable a decade ago. Kazakhstan understands the direction of history, that Russia's economic and political decline makes dependency dangerous. The nation that once relied on Moscow for protection is now learning to protect itself from Moscow. Armenia tells another story, one steeped in disappointment and disillusionment. For years, Yerevan viewed Russia as its ultimate guarantor of security, especially in its long-standing conflict with Azerbaijan over Nagorno-Karabakh. Yet, when crisis struck, Russia stood idle. The absence of meaningful support during Armenia's most vulnerable moment marked a breaking point. The promises of partnership proved empty, and Armenia has since begun to look westward toward the European Union and even the United States for diplomatic and economic engagement. It's not just a strategic pivot, it's a statement of lost faith. Moscow's silence during Armenia's struggle spoke louder than any speech Putin could deliver. Even Belarus, often seen as the last truly loyal ally, is showing signs of quiet unease. Alexander Lukashenko's survival depends heavily on Russian support, but that dependence has become a double-edged sword. The war in Ukraine has forced Belarus into an uncomfortable position, trapped between a weakened benefactor and an increasingly hostile international community. While publicly loyal, Lukashenko knows his country's future cannot be tied forever to a declining power. His cautious distancing, his efforts to maintain a semblance of sovereignty, all signal that even the most dependent partners are reassessing the cost of loyalty. Beyond these individual nations, a broader transformation is unfolding across Eastern Europe and Central Asia. The old balance of fear that once kept Russia's neighbors compliant has eroded. In its place emerges a more pragmatic politics, one where smaller nations are asserting independence and pursuing diversified partnerships. Western nations are seizing the opportunity, offering trade, investment, and security cooperation. China, too, is expanding its footprint in Central Asia, filling the void left by Russia's retreat. Moscow's former sphere of influence has become a marketplace of competing powers, and Russia is no longer the dominant buyer. This geopolitical drift has profound symbolic meaning. It shows that Russia's claim to be a global power capable of commanding loyalty through prestige and protection has been irreparably damaged. The fear that once ensured obedience has turned into caution against entanglement. Each country distancing itself from Moscow chips away at the myth of Russian resurgence. And for Putin, a leader obsessed with restoring the grandeur of the Soviet past, there is no greater humiliation than watching the empire he tried to rebuild unravel one alley at a time. What makes this shift even more dramatic is its quietness. There are no open declarations of defiance, no dramatic exits from Russian-led alliances. Instead, the betrayal unfolds in silence through new trade deals, diplomatic visits, and subtle policy realignments. It is a betrayal born not of ideology, but of realism. These nations see what many in Russia refuse to acknowledge: the empire is weakening. Its promises are hollow and its future uncertain. The post-Soviet space is no longer looking toward Moscow for direction. It is looking beyond it. The Kremlin's influence, once felt in every capital from Minsk to Bishkek, now lingers like an echo of the past. The empire that tried to hold its neighbors close through fear and dependency is now watching them drift away, not in rebellion, but in quiet resignation. And that, perhaps, is the most devastating form of loss. When those who once followed you stop believing you are worth following at all. The war in Ukraine was meant to be Vladimir Putin's masterstroke, the defining moment that would restore Russia's dominance and cement his image as the leader who revived the nation's imperial pride. Instead, it has become the most catastrophic miscalculation of his rule, a strategic backfire that has transformed Russia from an assertive power into a global cautionary tale. What began as a campaign to expand influence has evolved into a slow, grinding conflict that bleeds resources, isolates allies, and exposes the limitations of Russian strength. Every empire falls when ambition outpaces reality, and for Putin, Ukraine has become the stage upon which that lesson plays out with brutal clarity. When Russian tanks first crossed into Ukraine, the Kremlin projected confidence. The state's media machine promised a swift victory, a show of force that would remind the West of Russia's might. But the war that was supposed to last days turned into months and then into years. Each failed offensive, each retreat disguised as a strategic repositioning, stripped away the myth of invincibility that Putin had carefully built over 2 decades. The image of a calculating strongman commanding a disciplined, modern military has given way to the reality of a struggling army bogged down by poor logistics, corruption, and crumbling morale. What was intended to be a demonstration of strength has revealed profound weakness, not just in the Russian military, but in the state itself. The strategic backfire of this war lies not only in its human and economic toll, but in its global consequences. Far from dividing NATO, Putin's aggression has revitalized it. The very alliance he sought to weaken has expanded, growing stronger and more unified than at any point since the Cold War. Countries like Finland and Sweden, long cautious about joining Western military structures, rushed toward NATO membership, citing Russia's invasion as the final proof that neutrality was no longer safe. Instead of demonstrating Moscow's power, the war exposed its vulnerability, turning Russia from a feared adversary into a nation viewed with pity and distrust. Economically, the war has been nothing short of a disaster. Billions of dollars are drained from the Russian treasury to fund a conflict with no clear end, while sanctions suffocate industries and drive talent out of the country. The so-called fortress economy that the Kremlin boasts of is built on sand, sustained by shrinking energy revenues and desperate trade deals with nations that view Russia as a bargain supplier rather than a respected partner. The once thriving energy diplomacy that gave Moscow leverage over Europe has collapsed, replaced by discounted oil shipments to Asia and a shrinking domestic budget. Putin's attempt to weaponize energy has backfired spectacularly. Europe adapted, diversified, and survived, while Russia became trapped in its own overreliance. On the domestic front, the political consequences are even more corrosive. Every prolonged war brings fatigue, and fatigue breeds dissent. While open protest in Russia remains dangerous, dissatisfaction is growing beneath the surface. Mothers of soldiers, displaced families, and disillusioned veterans are beginning to question the purpose of endless sacrifice. The propaganda that once unified the population now struggles to drown out the whispers of anger and doubt. The Kremlin's increasing reliance on repression, censorship, and intimidation is not a sign of strength, but of fear. The system is tightening its grip precisely because it feels the grip slipping. The strategic failure also extends to Russia's global reputation. Countries that once viewed Moscow as a reliable partner now see a reckless aggressor. The soft power that Russia cultivated through culture, media, and diplomacy has been replaced by the hard image of a nation defined by invasion and brutality. Even its traditional allies tread carefully, wary of being dragged into the consequences of Putin's misadventure. The war, rather than elevating Russia's status, has reduced it to a pariah, a country spoken of in terms of sanctions, war crimes, and failed ambitions. The most painful irony is that the war in Ukraine has achieved the exact opposite of what it intended. Instead of expanding Russia's borders, it has shrunk its influence. Instead of securing its dominance, it has exposed its dependence. And instead of strengthening Putin's legacy, it has begun to unravel it. The empire he sought to build has turned into a trap of his own making, one that consumes resources, trust, and the future of an entire generation. What was meant to be a display of control has spiraled into chaos. Russia now stands on the world stage not as a victor, but as a cautionary tale of hubris, isolation, and decline. The war in Ukraine will not be remembered as Putin's triumph, but as the moment he overreached, the moment when his empire began to crumble from the weight of its own ambition. And perhaps the greatest tragedy for Russia is that the man who promised to restore its greatness may be remembered as the one who ensured its downfall. The collapse of Russia's imperial influence is not an isolated event confined to its borders. It is an earthquake whose tremors are reshaping the global balance of power. Every decision made in Moscow now ripples through Europe, Asia, and beyond, forcing nations to reconsider alliances, military strategies, and economic dependencies. The unraveling of Putin's empire is not just a Russian story, it is a global reckoning. The shifting tides of influence are redrawing maps, redefining partnerships, and exposing the fragility of an international order that has long depended on predictable power structures. The world is watching not only how Russia falls, but how the vacuum it leaves will be filled. In Europe, the collapse of Russian dominance has triggered both relief and unease. For decades, European nations lived under the shadow of Moscow's energy and military leverage. The fear of gas cutoffs and the specter of Russian aggression dictated political caution. Now, as Russia's power wanes, Europe finds itself both liberated and vulnerable. Energy independence has brought a new sense of autonomy, but it has also revealed the continent's deep structural weaknesses. The urgency to adapt, to secure alternative energy sources, strengthen collective defense, and confront economic instability has reshaped Europe's identity. The European Union, once hesitant and divided, has become more unified in purpose, but unity forged in crisis is always fragile. The fall of Russian influence may empower Europe, but it also tests its resilience in ways unseen since the Cold War. Across Asia, the shockwaves are even more complex. China, while publicly maintaining its partnership with Russia, is quietly recalibrating its own strategy. Beijing sees opportunity in Moscow's weakness, a chance to expand its economic reach and tighten its grip over Central Asia, a region Russia once controlled with unquestioned authority. Yet, China's leaders also recognize the danger of instability spreading too close to their borders. An unpredictable, weakened Russia is both a partner and a liability. The power vacuum in Eurasia invites competition not only from China, but from regional players like Turkey, India, and Iran, each eager to expand their influence in a shifting geopolitical landscape. The collapse of Russia's empire thus becomes the stage for a new great game, one driven not by ideology, but by the raw pursuit of resources, trade routes, and strategic advantage. The United States, long at odds with Moscow, faces its own set of challenges. On one hand, Washington has achieved what decades of diplomacy and deterrence could not, a diminished Russia, isolated and weakened. On the other hand, the unpredictability of this decline poses grave risks. A destabilized Russia, armed with nuclear weapons and desperate for relevance, represents a geopolitical wildcard. The West may celebrate its strategic victory, but it must also prepare for the chaos that often follows the collapse of great powers. History has shown that empires rarely fade quietly. They fracture, they lash out, they drag others into their turmoil. The fall of Russia's global influence, if mismanaged, could ignite crises far beyond Eastern Europe. For the developing world, the shift in power offers both opportunity and uncertainty. Nations in Africa, the Middle East, and Latin America that once benefited from Russian trade, arms, or political support must now adapt to a changing landscape. Some will turn toward China's expanding influence. Others will look westward for new partnerships. The end of Russia's imperial reach opens doors, but also leaves gaps that rival powers will rush to fill. In this race to realign, smaller nations may find themselves once again as pawns in a larger game, caught between competing empires trying to reshape the world order in their image. What makes this moment so pivotal is that it exposes the interdependence of global power. Russia's decline is not simply a story of one nation's failure. It is a test of how the world responds to shifting dominance in an age of economic uncertainty, technological transformation, and political polarization. The institutions that emerged from the 20th century, the United Nations, NATO, the global financial system, were built for stability, not for the unpredictable chaos of collapsing empires. As Russia's influence contracts, those institutions are being stretched to their limits, forced to adapt or risk irrelevance. Perhaps the most striking consequence of Russia's decline is psychological rather than political. The myth of unshakable power, whether Russian, American, or Chinese, is fading. The world is entering an era where no empire, no matter how vast, can rely solely on coercion or fear to maintain dominance. Economic strength, technological innovation, and moral legitimacy now define power far more than territorial control or military might. Russia's downfall illustrates this shift with painful precision. Its tanks may still roll, but its economy stumbles. Its propaganda may still echo, but its credibility has vanished. The empire that sought to inspire fear now inspires caution, a reminder that in the modern age, collapse does not come with a roar, but with a gradual loss of influence, respect, and belief. As the dust settles, the global order stands at a crossroads. The collapse of Putin's empire signals not the end of geopolitics, but its transformation. The world is realigning, and every nation, from Washington to Beijing, from Brussels to New Delhi, is recalculating its place within this new and uncertain balance. What we are witnessing is not just the fall of one empire, but the rewriting of the rules that will define the next century of power.